It's time to get going. Am I making any noise? Looks like I am. Full of happiness and joy. I live. Hello, my little darlings. Good evening, or afternoon, or whatever the heck it is in your neck of the woods. It's Mike Meyers. And today, you are a proud member of the Mike Meyers Ask Mike Anything. Today's topic is going to be VLANs, and in particular, we're going to be talking about inter-VLAN routing, which is always such a mysterious thing, and I don't know why. It's actually pretty straightforward, but I think it's important that we cover that. Last week, we did a pretty intensive discussion on VLAN, and I might want to take a moment to review a couple of VLAN points because people tend to get a little bit confused on these things. So let me take a look. First of all, Nigel. Hey, Nigel Bunt. We have another Nigel who shows up a lot, but not Nigel Bunt. Nigel, welcome aboard. Glad to see you. Mohammed, good to see you again. Will Shaw, my brother. Kylie, hey, Kylie, how's it going, kid? And Tolwood, of course, my anchor, my rock. From you I shall build my church. And, of course, being wonderfully supported by the wonderful, the meek, the lovely Dave Rush, or Captain Rush as we like to call him, especially when he wears that special outfit that we all like so much. His pilot's outfit. Dave Rush was a commercial pilot for many, many years. What do you think I was talking about? God, you people. Sorry, Dave, I got to watch these guys. So what I want to do is talk about a few things. In particular, I want everybody to let's do a couple of push-ups and talk about VLANs, okay? In particular, can anybody, it's tricky, man, I almost wish I could talk to you guys. First of all, let's remember why we do VLANs, okay? The main reason we do VLANs is, number one, security, and then the second reason we do VLANs is to provide reliability of networks. VLANs allow us to take one or more physical switches and change it into one or more virtual switches, ergo VLAN. When people go, wow, why would you ever want to use a VLAN? Usually my answer is other than the smallest of home networks, can you come up with a reason not to use a VLAN? Start off with some easy ones. You're in a coffee shop. This is an example we did. We just did this last week. You're at a coffee shop and you want to have a public Wi-Fi, but that thing plugs into the same switch as your file server and your POS, point of sale system. So you don't want people being able to get to that stuff, right? So we use VLANs as a separation tool for security. Another reason we use VLANs is a lot of times we'll have certain departments. We do this at Total Seminars all the time. Our production and our post-production folks move massive amounts of data around the network, as they should when we're doing videos and such. So we segment those guys off so they're not choking out the rest of the entire network. And we try to help them out too. By taking out other people's overhead, it helps them as well. So those are the reasons we do VLANs, folks. Security and reliability of signal, bandwidth, whatever you want to call it. The standard that pretty much all of this is based on is the old EEE 802.1q, and you will get that on certification exams, and you should make sure you know that. There were, I guess technically there still are, but there were proprietary protocols. In particular, Cisco had a few that, well, let's face it, a lot of the Cisco proprietary protocols were the core upon which a lot of 802.1q actually was built. So that can be something we need to keep in mind as well. So VLANs are everywhere. VLANs work at layer 2, okay? VLANs work at layer 2. We put them on switches, okay? A pure router has nothing to do with VLANs, okay? At all. Now, what happens though in our world, if you're going to be using VLANs, one of the big challenges we run into is that if you have VLANs, you often want to reconnect them somewhere. Like you've got all these VLANs and then you've got one router out to the internet. You want all these VLANs to be able to get to the internet. It's probably one of the more common things. So in that case, you have to either interconnect the VLANs with real routers, and this is done all the time, folks. You interconnect them with real routers, or you can do what's known generically as router on a stick, where you can have one interface, and then that is a trunked VLAN, and you can have that one router on a stick. It doesn't really mean a stick, folks. It could be, but most of the time it's a small device with one interface plugged in, and it handles all the routing that way, just going through the same interface, giving the right IP addresses to everything. Or you can use inter-VLAN routing. And in order to use inter-VLAN routing, you need a very specific type of switch known as a layer 3 switch. Layer 3 switches are not new, kids. They've been around for probably close to 20 years, certainly 15 years. A layer 3 switch is a switch with all the VLAN capabilities, but also it incorporates, as well as other things, one of the big things it incorporates is the concept of inter-VLAN routing. Inter-VLAN routing basically makes virtualized routers within a switch. Now that sounds all exciting and crazy, but it's actually fairly trivial, and we're going to go through that process today. Baptiste, Mr. Meyers, hello, hello. Hey, Baptiste. Sorry, whenever you hear me see me do that, I'm just checking to see what everybody's saying out there. So anyway, what I want to do is go through a situation. Before we do that, I want to talk about one more thing. I got a couple of emails on this. And if I have, in fact, let me see if I can actually pull back. I still have the old presentation. Give me just a second. I should have kept one of the machines around just to have been able to do this. Darn. I don't have it on me. Shoot. All right. Well, no big deal. One of the questions that people run into is, and we did this last week, I just want to make sure we're okay on the concept of tagged versus untagged VLANs. You can have a VLAN that spans multiple switches. So if I've got 1, 2, 3 switches, I can have VLAN 1, VLAN 2, VLAN 3 interspersed around those. I can have a couple of ports on the first switch be VLAN 1, a couple of other ports on the second switch be VLAN 1, a couple of ports on the third switch be VLAN 1. I can put 4 or 5 ports. They don't have to be in order. They don't have to be in a physical group. You can you configure them individually. These can be in VLAN 2. Some of these can be in VLAN 2. Some of these. Do you understand? I'm hoping everybody's kind of going like this right now. In order to move the data between these VLAN values, I have to use trunk ports. So a trunk port generically simply means I'm not really a member of any VLAN. I just pass all the data between them. Now this is a problem we run into, in particular, people who learn VLANs from Cisco. Because when you set up in Cisco, when you set up a trunk port, it basically trunks all the different VLANs. So let's say I have VLAN 1, VLAN 2, and VLAN 3. Get the idea? By default, with most Cisco devices, I'm sure they've probably updated. I have not worked on a modern Cisco device in a few years, since certainly before Corona. They would just trunk everything. However, that's not necessarily the way trunking works, folks. Most of the time what happens in a trunk is you say, okay, here's port number 1, which is going to be connected to port number 1 on the other switch. I can set it up as a trunk, but maybe I only want certain VLANs to go through. You're like, well, Mike, why would I ever want to connect 2 switches, have multiple VLANs, and not have them go through? Because it might just be a little VLAN that's doing interconnections for cameras or something. I've got a web interface I could access. I do inter-VLAN routing. There's a trillion reasons. So on a lot of switches, when you're configuring a VLAN, what you do is when you're setting up these trunks, you basically go, so this port 1 is going to be tagged for VLAN 1. And it's going to be tagged for VLAN, so you go to VLAN 2, it's going to port 1, say tagged for VLAN 2. And basically what you're saying is, it is a trunk, but specifically trunked for specific VLANs. When you see untagged, or U, that basically means it's not a trunk. It's just a generic VLAN port. So hopefully that makes sense to you guys. Baptiste, why use a VLAN? Okay. I think I answered that one, but we can try again. Baptiste, if you have a coffee shop and you have a wireless network, do you want people getting onto your wireless network? Which, by the way, people like wireless network. We're the people who configure the plumbing, Baptiste. So that wire comes from the back of the wireless access point and it goes back into your switch in your little office. And you're like, oh, well, where else do you want to put it? You've got one internet service provider, and that internet service provider is plugged into your switch. The people in the coffee shop want to get to Google. What are you going to do, Baptiste? What you're going to do is you're going to set up a VLAN, and only that SSID goes to one particular VLAN. That way, it protects the rest of your network. That's one good reason, Baptiste. Here's another good reason. You have a video department that moves massive amounts of data. And if we plug everybody into that same switch, Baptiste, we will drop the network down to nothing. So what we do, Baptiste, is we set all of the art department or the post-production people into a separate VLAN, and that way they're not choking everybody else out. Now, Baptiste, you're going to look at me and go, Mike, why don't I just buy another switch? Baptiste, you can. You absolutely could just go out and buy more switches, stack those things up 8 deep, and in 6 months you're going to get fired because we're going to get a proper technician who knows how to use VLANs. Baptiste, I need you to type something back in. Baptiste, I need you to type, say, Mike, those examples make sense to me. I need to see that from you. I will wait. Baptiste, type, beep, 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 beep. All right, Baptiste, I know you're going to be there for me, brother, so we will move on. So again, guys, you got to remember, don't ask me where VLANs are used. Ask me where VLANs are not used. They're not used in little home networks where people don't really care about proper load control and don't care about security. I mean, come on. Everybody uses VLANs. Also, do keep in mind, Baptiste, please watch my episode from last week. Whoops, what's happening? We go through a lot of examples, and Baptiste, we actually set up VLANs, we set up trunking, we do all of that. So, definitely want to watch that. All right. So you've set up VLANs, and now you want to start interconnecting stuff. Fair enough. And the way we interconnect stuff is with layer 3 switches. You need, if you're doing VLANs, you're probably going to have to do layer 3 switches. You don't have to. One more time, folks. If you want to, you can take a switch and have some VLAN 1 and some VLAN 2, and you can plug a real router. You can actually drop a router on top of that layer 2 switch and make 2 connections, and it'll work great. Really, it'll work fantastically well. You can do the router on a stick like we described. However, most people really like to do layer 3 switches. They've been around for a long time. You can get decent layer 3 switches for the $200 to $400 range. And they have a lot of features in there that make it more convenient. Why go buy another router if you can get an L3 router, L3 switch, and you can just do inter-VLAN routing? L3 switches are also very popular for things like wireless networks because they'll have PoE, PoE plus connections, so you can string all of your wireless access points into one switch, which is pretty common. Or if you're in a big enterprise into multiple switches and all separate VLANs for separate SSIDs, have nice controls on that. So layer 3 switches are good. Then people often say to me, Mike, well, how do I know I have a layer 3 switch? Because number one, you're not going to be paying $80 for it. Number two, they advertise, I mean, it's on the box, man. They're pretty proud of a layer 3 switch, folks. And they are very clear which ones are layer 3 and which ones aren't. Right now, I'm very much enjoying for layer 3 switches. I'm doing some work with Netgear. I have worked with Cisco in the past for a long time, even going back to the old 3550s. Unify, I've been messing with those guys for layer 3. And I'm not going to tell you which one's best. I will tell you this, and I'm going to say it's like 4 more times. Every layer 3 switch is different. And how to configure it changes every time. So be aware of that. All right, let's go look into a process here. So here I got myself a little switch. And I've got, say, in this particular example, I got some computers hooked to it. Now, what I've got here is I've got a wireless access point. And what I've done in this case, I've got a second one plugged in. So I've got 2 wireless access points. Yes, people, I know that you can buy wireless access points that support multiple SSIDs. In fact, you can easily buy wireless access points that support multiple VLANs, okay? But for the sake of understanding what we're trying to do here, let's just pretend like we have 2 separate WAPs and each one is projecting out an SSID. One is our in-house protected wireless and the other one is going to be a public network. All right, so what I'm going to do here is by default, this thing's all going to be on VLAN 1, which is the native VLAN or default VLAN. Now, we don't like that. In fact, let me go back one. All right, so if you look here in the upper left-hand corner, there's a wire out to some router somewhere. When you buy a layer 3 switch, in fact, if you buy almost any managed switch that has VLAN capabilities, when it comes out of the box, it's already configured for VLANs, folks, but it's all usually preset to VLAN 1 across the board. So if a switch is configured such that every port is already on the same VLAN, that means it's going to act exactly like a dumb switch. Think about that for a minute, okay? Now, we go into these switches and we do configurations. We're going to talk about how we get into these guys in a minute. The problem with these types of setups is that it's awful, all right? We have no real control, we have no security, and this is why we buy layer 3 switches so that we can get some security and get some control in there. So what we're going to do now is I want to isolate that 802.11 SSID used for the public from the rest of the network. That way people can't come in and start poking on, pinging my file server or my point of sale system. So we're going to create 2 VLANs, VLAN 2 for the private and VLAN 3 for the public, okay? So then we're going to set up inter-VLAN routing to filter VLAN 2 from VLAN 3. So that's the whole goal here, okay? So basically what we're going to do is we're going to have this guy here. He's going to be all plugged in. This is our other WAP. So we're going to set this guy up all as VLAN 2 and this guy all up as VLAN 3. We spent an entire episode going through different switches, learning how to set up VLANs. I do not want to repeat that, all right? So if you don't know how to set up a VLAN, go watch the previous episode, and we go through that with like 4 different kinds of switches, at least 3, and you'll know how to do that. All right, let's go back in. So here's the steps. Number 1, let's go ahead and create VLAN 2 and 3. Then we're going to assign network IDs for each VLAN. Now, whoa, wait a minute, Mike. Whoops. VLANs work at layer 2. So how can we set an IP address to a VLAN? Well, not only can you do it, but if you want to do inter-VLAN routing, you absolutely have to do it. I can't tell you how it's done on your layer 3 switch. I'll show you some examples today, but you're going to have to apply a network ID to a VLAN. The main way we do that is, let's say VLAN 2, we want that to be, I'm just making these up quickly. VLAN 2 is going to be 192.168.2 dot whatever, WAC 24, okay? If on a lot of systems, all I do is I say VLAN 2, interface VLAN 2, this is Cisco, interface VLAN 2, and then I just type in not a network ID, but an actual address, like 192.168.2.1, and then WAC 24, or if it's Cisco, it's 255.255.255.0, just how Cisco does it. When you do that, you basically say, I'm expecting every port in VLAN 2 to have an address 192.168.2 dot something. And there will be like this invisible port called 192.168.2.1, which is going to kind of act like its own little DHCP server. That's a pretty common way to do that. So in essence, just by snapping your computer into a certain port, the layer 3 switch will act as a DHCP server and give you that information. In fact, you can go through on most layer 3 switches and say, well, for VLAN 2, I want this gateway. You can go nuts in all that setup, or you can do it statically. The nice part is, folks, if you give all of the computers on a particular VLAN a network ID, you can route on it. Does that make sense? You can route on it. So, cool. But do keep in mind that if you're going to be setting up inter-VLAN routing, you will apply some network ID. I don't care what it is. It doesn't matter to me. Just use something you can remember and configure. That's all. There's no law of physics here. Probably use a private address. All right. So then we assign ports to each VLAN. That's what we do. And if you were watching last week, you see how to assign ports to a VLAN. Then number 4, you set up inter-VLAN routing between the VLAN 2 and VLAN 3. Setting up inter-VLAN routing on a layer 3 switch is like so easy that it's actually dangerous. Most of the time on a layer 3 switch, and I'll give you an example here in a minute. Most of the time on a layer 3 switch, you go to a VLAN setting, and one of the VLAN settings is enable routing, and you hit yes, and baby, that's routing, like automatically. Static route. If it's a route that's directly connected to that layer 3 switch, it will automatically route it. Automatically. Yeah. Everything. So we don't want everything to go between these guys, right? So what we have to do instead is then we have to create access control lists to handle the traffic from VLAN 3 to VLAN 2. So every layer 3 switch not only allows you to turn on routing, in fact, a lot of times they don't even call it inter-VLAN routing. They're like, enable routing? Yes. In fact, on a lot of layer 3 switches, it's turned on by default. Woohoo! So, yeah, not good. Or maybe very good, depends on how you look at configurations on stuff like that. But the bottom line is that you better start setting up some access control lists. And in a layer 3 switch, because it's VLAN aware, you're going to say, well, from everything from VLAN 2, block it from getting to VLAN 3. Or everything from VLAN 3, allow. Or everything from VLAN 2 that is on port 80, block it. You guys have done access control lists on a regular home router. It's pretty much the same. It's just, instead of talking about from my WAN to my LAN, you talk about from your VLAN to your VLAN. That's it, okay? So let's take a look at some examples of this. All right, so creating VLANs. Now here's like one example. Folks, I've just pulled stuff from different places. So this is a classic, I think this is Cisco, it looks like Cisco to me, where we can set up a VLAN. So we call a VLAN 10 and we give it some name. We call it IT. We make a VLAN 20, call it sales. You get the idea. So creating a VLAN is pretty trivial. Just remember VLANs start from the number 1 and go to, oh my gosh, I forgot. 4094. 4094? I'll say that with authority, so it sounds good. And you don't have to make, if you have most switches already have a VLAN 1 out of the box. So your next VLAN is going to be VLAN 2. But after you make a VLAN 2, you can make a VLAN 10. You don't have to be sequential, okay? You don't have to do them in order. You can make a VLAN 2, then you can make a VLAN 6. Nobody cares. So you create your VLANs. Next, you assign network IDs. So in this particular example, I'm using a Cisco setup again. So here I'm talking in, I say, oh, for interface VLAN 10, I want it to be IP address 10.0.10.1 on a WAC 24. So you look at that and you go, Mike, that's not a network ID. Yeah, it is, kind of. What you're doing is you're saying the VLAN itself is going to be 10.0.10.1. But Mike, that's not a port. Yeah, I know it's not a port. It's the VLAN. It's like when you access the VLAN, that is where you go to. Well, what about all the ports? Yeah, well, then you're going to have to deal with that. because you put a WAC 24 on there, that means it's going to be it's going to be expecting 10.0.10. something on every other device that connects to that particular VLAN. Okay, well, how does that get that? Well, that's up to you and the layer 3 switch you buy. You buy a nicer layer 3 switch, it'll probably have DHCP capabilities, a per VLAN DHCP capability. Pretty common. Unify has these. That's one way to do that. The other thing, you might have to set them up statically, or you might have to actually get a DHCP server. You know, you might have to blow the dust off that DHCP server cable with your Windows server and use that. Okay, all right. So we assign the network IDs. Next, we assign the ports to VLANs. Now look, we've already seen this, so I don't want to go through this. Here's a graphical where you can see the U and the T there at the bottom. So they're tagging everything on port 20 in this particular example. I don't even know where that came from. I think that's Unify. Okay, and then next we enable inter-VLAN routing. Remember, whoops. I was getting vehement there. So remember, on a lot of layer 3 switches, just making VLANs turns on inter-VLAN routing. On a lot of them, you have to turn it off. But here, let's take a look at this example I got here. So it's a little bit tight to read, but if you look, I think it's right here where it says enable routing. And then this is like the basic routing information. You got to remember, if you have 3 different routes plugging into, forget switches for a minute. Let's go back to routers for a minute. So most routers, if you plug 3 different routes into it, these are directly connected. Do you understand? They have ports on each one of these which are directly connected. And by default, pretty much every device, unless you tell it not to, every device on Earth, if it sees it's directly connected to 10.0.10 on one side and 192.168.4 on the other, it will automatically start forward routing. It will do it. You don't have to do anything. Just bring up a routing table and you're going to see it right there. You don't have to configure anything. You just turn on routing, boom, and off it goes. That's it. With a layer 3 switch, when you have 1, 2, 3, however many VLANs, and you have established the network ID for each one of those VLANs, it's routing, baby. You want to prove it to yourself? Plug something into VLAN 2, and it's going to get a 192.168.4. Plug somebody else into VLAN 3, and it's going to get a 10.0.10. Try pinging. It'll ping. There's nothing to do. It just goes. Well, make sure they have IP addresses. Either configure them statically or set up DHCP or whatever you want to do. Enabling inter-VLAN routing is so easy that it's a little dangerous. Because I mean, you think about this. You light up inter-VLAN routing, that little wireless access point for the for everybody else out there. Granted, it will have a different IP address, but it's still going to be routable. If somebody could figure out what your internal network is, so everybody in the coffee shop who's plugging in, they're getting 10.0.10.44 or whatever, if they can figure out that your internal network is 192.168.4. whatever, they have full access. There is nothing blocking it. They can do whatever they want to do. Okay, let's move on. Yeah, okay, there I had them checked. So if you check that box, it means routing's enabled on that particular VLAN. Okay, so then the last thing you got to do, and this is a little hairy, depending on the system, but you got to configure access control lists. So here is actually an older, you can still buy these Cisco RV345s, and it's a little shaded, but you can actually see in here. So this is, I set up a rule. This is a deny rule. I can set it up for IPv4, IPv6, and I can say anything from VLAN 2 blocked from VLAN 1. I can set source addresses for individual things, anything else I might want to do. But you see that? That is one example. I can have it scheduled for certain times during the I can do all kinds of stuff. I I'm assuming that you guys know how to set up an access control list. A lot of times it just takes horse sense. Like for example, if you have this public SSID in the coffee shop and you've got that all on VLAN 2, do you want them to get to VLAN 3 at all? Ever? You don't. You don't. So what do you do about that? Well, you can block them. Well, that can run into another problem, and that problem is well, how do they get to the internet? So we're going to talk about that for a minute. Hang on a second. Oh, no, I got them here. All right. All right, so number one, couple of warnings. Every L3 switch is different, so don't even bother asking me how to do these on your switch, because I don't know how to do it, folks. They're all different, okay? And you're going to have to take some time and figure out how to make all this work on yours. It could be, well, famous Chuck Yeager story. You ready? Okay. If you don't know who Chuck Yeager is, well, you're no friend of mine. Chuck Yeager was a famous test pilot who just recently passed, just a few years ago. He was the inventor of the term, the right stuff. And Chuck Yeager would, in the 50s and 60s, when we were coming out with new airplanes every week, Chuck Yeager, he'd saunter, because, you know, he's a great American hero. So he would saunter out onto the tarmac, and he would talk to the people from Lockheed or Republic or Boeing or whatever it was, and here's this shiny new airplane that nobody has ever flown before, okay? So Chuck Yeager would go up to it, and Chuck Yeager would say this. You ready? He would say, how do you start this aircraft? Because folks, there are 10 million different ways to start a jet airplane, as Dave Rush can attribute that. There are so many different ways to start it. You know, you got these checklists, and you got to flip this and flip that and turn that dial and, you know, hit the throttle or whatever it might be, that there's always a different way to do it. However, you always have to start the jet airplane. And Chuck Yeager knew that. This is exactly the perfect analogy for inter-VLAN routing on L3 switches. I have no idea of how to do it on your particular device, but I know I have to do it. I know I have to go through these steps. It's just, how do I do it on your switch? Figure it out. That's why we get the big bucks, kids. Gotta have a mint. All right. So some switches use a web interface. Some have command line interfaces. Some have apps. You can actually configure them from your phone these days. Some have all of these, and you have to use them all. This drives some people crazy. Particular brands, I'm going to pick on Unify one more time. Unify has a pretty good graphics interface for configuring their routers and stuff, but there's still a lot of times with a Unify device where you have to go to their command line to do something. So even though it does have a graphical user interface, that doesn't mean you get out of command line. And for the record, once you start getting comfortable with command line stuff, it's very hard to go back to a graphical user interface, simply because command line's a lot faster. You know, that's all it boils down to. Okay, back to it. Okay, the most important thing is that you have to organize your steps and then figure out how... Try that again. English is not my first language today. So you organize your steps, then you figure out how your switch sets up inter-VLAN routing. This is the big mistake people make. Don't even think about starting all of this without having all of this sketched out on a piece of paper. Drawing those rounded rectangles, man. Which boxes go in where? It's not at all uncommon. Sketching out, you know, make an ugly sketch out of your switches and make little boxes for every port that's on there, and, you know, and document this stuff before you do anything, because you're going to make mistakes. Everybody screws this up. Welcome to the club. That's part of the reason you make the big bucks. You're going to trash this. So you want to document as much as you can so that your process is easier, okay? All right. Now the problem I have with that example I just gave you is we can do better than that. Because in the previous example, all we did was block VLAN 3 from VLAN 2. But don't they both need internet access? They do. So what I want to do is this time, let's go ahead and bring in a router. So this is a Verizon router I got. And you'll notice that I'm plugging it into port 1 on this particular switch. And I'm going to call that VLAN 100. That's VLAN 100. There's nothing special about the number 100. I could have called it VLAN 1000. I could have called it VLAN 777. Who cares? People get weirded out. Why did you call that VLAN 100, Mike? Because 99 was taken. I don't know. Let's get back to it. All right. So here is my this is my public SSID. So I'm going to call him VLAN 3. He's going to be the only one on there. And then I'm going to pick some other number of devices these are all my private devices. I'm going to put them all on VLAN 2. Okay? So just so you guys know, the router, the LAN side of the router is configured 192.168.5. The router is 192.168.5.1, but it's got a DHCP server. It's passing out 192.168.5s. How do I know that? Because I'm the one who set up the router. When I got it from Verizon, I went into the router and configured it, and I said I want it to be passing out 192.168.5s. That's important because we now know what to assign as the network ID for VLAN 100, right? Okay. Let's get back to this. All right, so let's go through the steps. We already talked about these steps. Let's go to it. Number 1, create VLAN 2, VLAN 3, and VLAN 100. I am not going to show you guys how to do that again because I've shown you twice. Number 2, assign a network ID for each VLAN. Now, I've given you one example, but in this particular one, I have chosen to set up VLAN 2 with 192.168.2.1 on a WAC 24 and VLAN 3 192.168.3.1. Look, I know it says VLAN 3 and I'm using the third octet as a 3. I don't have to do that. I'm not a very organized network person, so anything I can cheat on a little bit to help me remember stuff, I'm going to do. So when I'm assigning network IDs to particular VLANs, if I have a VLAN 2, I'm probably going to want to put a 2 in it just because it's easy for me to remember, okay? Oh yeah, and then VLAN 100, I'm going to set it up as 192.168.5.10, just like that. Okay, so next we're going to assign ports to each VLAN. We've already done that in previous episode. I don't want to do that again. Number 4, we set up inter-VLAN routing between VLAN 2 and 3. We basically just hit the checkbox that says, is VLAN 2 routable? Yes. Is VLAN 3 routable? Yes. If we hit those checkboxes, then it's up and running. In a command line, I think it's something really simple like VLAN, you get to configuration for VLAN 2 and then you say enable routing. Don't make it hard, folks. It's actually pretty easy. All right, and then the last step, what is the last step? Anybody remember? We have to create proper access control lists. So I'm assuming you guys have created access control lists on home routers and stuff. In those, you're basically blocking what's coming in from the internet, right? Or blocking what's coming from your network out to the internet. You can do that. So the only difference, people get all weirded out. They're like, oh my gosh, this is all new and different because this has to do with inter-VLAN routing. Therefore, it has to be completely different. I'm confused. Mike Meyers is a terrible instructor. No, I'm a great instructor. What you have to remember, folks, is that in a layer 3 switch, instead of just saying blocking from WAN to LAN, it's going to say which VLANs do you want to block or enable or filter or time schedule, blocking IP addresses, allowing IP addresses, blocking MAC addresses, allowing MAC addresses. It's the same stuff you've done 1,000 times, but instead of between a WAN and a LAN, it's between 2 different VLANs. That's it. You're not going to set up one ACL. You're going to have to set up a few ACLs. Let's think about what ACLs would have to be set up here. All right. So, number 1, what do we want them to do? Well, VLAN 2 needs internet access. All right. And remember, VLAN 100 is the connection to the internet, correct? So we need VLAN to be open to VLAN 100. VLAN 3 needs internet access, so we need VLAN 3 to have access to VLAN 100. But the thing is we want to block VLAN 3 from VLAN 2. I already showed you one example with a graphical interface on an L3 switch that blocks everything from one VLAN to another. Do you need to block it the other way? I don't know. Maybe. Not quite as important to me. Do I want my private systems to be blocked? Probably want to block them anyway because you've already blocked everything from 2 getting to 3, so anything you might want to do is going to be blocked on the way back anyway, so whatever, go ahead and block it back the other way. But in that case, I have effectively isolated my public wireless SSID from the rest of my network simply by using inter-VLAN routing and setting up 3 access control lists that separate it. That's it. Well, Mike, can you make this harder? Oh boy, can I make this harder. I'm not going to, but I could. Because guys, keep in mind, we've covered as deep as it's ever going to get on CompTIA, certainly Network Plus or Security Plus. But what's more important to me is that every single layer 3 switch is different. And even today in 2023, interfaces are changing so quickly that something I even showed you today would be utterly useless in 6 months probably, or a year. So remember, it's going to take a couple of tries to get this right. So let's talk about what I call the watch-outs of inter-VLAN routing. Number 1, there is no one method to inter-VLAN route. It could be a command line interface. It could be an app. That app could be downloaded onto a desktop. That app could be downloaded into a phone. It could have a web interface, or it could have combinations thereof. And just because you have one, don't think that you don't have to know the others. If you turn on routing, everything is almost certain. If you turn on inter-VLAN routing is what I should say there. If you turn on inter-VLAN routing, everything is wide open until you apply ACLs. So think about that when you're configuring. And then watch out for shortcuts. Unify is one example of that. And always remember, there's more than one way to set up a VLAN. Unify does some of the craziest things for inter-VLAN routing. Like it'll sit there and say, oh, is this a governance VLAN? Or is this a VLAN for internal to your, they use these terminologies. And basically what they're doing is they're setting up the VLAN for you and pre-configuring the access control list. Now you can also go into Unify and do it manually too. So don't think that you're locked in that. I love Unify equipment. I use it all the time. I'm a happy camper. I just happen to know some of its quirks, all right? Also keep in mind that not only are the interfaces different, but there's more than one way to set up a VLAN. Like for example, I've got, I don't know where it is. I've got a wireless access point that's laying around here. And this wireless access point, I can easily configure 2 SSIDs on one wireless access point. And in the configuration of that wireless access point, folks, each wireless access point can be assigned a VLAN. Got it? So when I get into my layer 3 switch, I can go into that layer 3 switch and I can say, I'm going to tag VLAN 2 and VLAN 3 just to that wireless access point. I can also use 2 wireless access points. Both of these are perfectly fine ways to do it. Don't think that there's only one way to do it and it's going to work. I've also seen some pretty inefficient ways to do things, and they work fine, and if it ain't broke, don't fix it. The bottom line is people need to be able to see the Google when they want to see the Google. You got to make sure they can't see the stuff you don't want to see. And other than that, that's going to be the biggest trick to inter-VLAN routing. It's fun. It's actually kind of interesting. You can buy relatively inexpensive layer 3 switches like on eBay and things these days. Cisco 250s. Gosh, even some of the old Cisco 3750s and stuff like that. Now, granted, these are not gigabit, but they work fine. And, well, the 250 is a gigabit. And you can actually play with these a little bit and work with it. Keep in mind, if you're going to do Cisco, it's probably all going to be command line. Might as well get started on your CCNA. There's be a lot of that type of stuff. Okay, so all right, let me scroll back. How are we doing on time? Not even paying attention. Oh goodness, 45 minutes. I just was pontificating. So let me scroll up. Nigel, this is over the top of my head. Nigel, this should not be over the top of your head. Nigel, this is cool stuff. Nigel, I challenge you, sir, to go watch the previous episode about VLANs and then come back and watch inter-VLAN routing. Wait a minute. Okay, here we go. Oh, thank you, Dave Rush. Yeah. Can't use VLAN 0 and you can't use VLAN 4095. Right. No. So guys, if I see an @ sign in a thing, I'm assuming you're not needing me. Mike, how do you do redundancy on OSPF for layer 3 switches? So Don, OSPF is not a layer 3 switch requirement. Most of the time, when you have layer 3 switches, they are assuming that they have a direct connection to a VLAN, and therefore none of the, RIP, OSPF, BGP dynamic routing protocols come into play. I've seen plenty of layer 3 switches that simply ignore it. If you don't have a direct connection to a network ID plugged into the switch, it's going to ignore it. Okay? So in terms of how OSPF and BGP work, I'll be honest with you, I have never taken the time to, there are layer 3 switches that certainly support OSPF. I have never taken the time to configure one. That would be weird to me. I'm not even sure why I would want to do that. Because if I lose an inter-VLAN route, I've lost the switch. You know what I mean? Layer 3 switches are something you keep in the house. They're not designed for, WAN interconnections. They're something you keep locally in your own rack. So we don't really concern ourselves with that type of issue. So Don, I'm going to tell you, I've never had anybody talk to me about OSPF on a layer 3 switch. I'm sure it could be done. I've never done it. But in my opinion, the nature of what layer 3 switching is, which are local switches that you keep, on every floor of your building and down to the basement, I don't need OSPF for a LAN, right? I need it for a WAN. Interesting though. Man, I got to tell you, Don, you asked me very, very interesting questions. I like that. Peter Hunt, enable VRRP, HSRP on the device and configure it, Don Odinga. I don't want to get into that, Peter, but yes, you can go that way. Okay, we only got a few more minutes. Let me go ahead. I'm scrambling past. Guys, we have all their standard offers and everything. Don't forget our new Discord channel. My email addresses are there. I'm going to skip over all this today simply because we're a little short on time. There you go, Dave Rush. Yeah, L3 switches are not full-featured routers. Although, Dave Rush, they can get pretty close. Mike, can you do a router on a switch for layer 3 switches? A router on a switch. I'm not sure what you mean by on a switch. So Don, Don, you make me nervous when you say things like this. What we've been talking about for the last hour is the reason we have layer 3 switches is they have the ability to have this inter-VLAN routing thing. So it's not so much on. I don't know what you mean by on a switch. Do you have, okay, on the Cisco layer 3 switch, do you have to enable IP routing? There are 17,000 different Cisco layer 3 switches. I believe that on Cisco switches, you usually do have to actually enable routes, and you have to enable it you have to do a generic enable, and then you have to enable it for every VLAN. I've done it through the command line interface 4 or 5 times. It's been a while though. Also, there is a command, IP routing on Cisco, that's supposed to be enabled. Well, okay, Don, is that the command? I'm a little rusty. Don, don't make me look it up right now. Check it. Do an iOS command reference and see if IP routing is the command that allows you to turn on routing for Cisco Layer 3 switches. I'm pretty sure it is. IP routing enable, yeah. I think it is. Don, I don't know for sure. I am never once have I claimed to be a Cisco expert. And Don, you can look that up faster than I could ever do it. Don, what's the major difference between native VLAN and default VLAN? As far as I'm concerned, they're the exact same thing, Don. Well, you guys are having some good conversation. Traffic is not tagged. Oh, gosh, Peter Hunt, you're right. Traffic is not tagged on a native VLAN. Yeah. Hey, Techie Tommy, good to see you walking in the door. Techie Tommy, I got a stupid... Woo! Mike, when assigning a VLAN to an access point, why do you define spanning tree link type as point-to-point? Oh, God. Because, Don, it's very, very easy. You know, we always talk about trying to avoid spanning tree, and I don't define it always as point-to-point. I don't know why you say that, Don. What I'm going to do with a spanning tree is it's very hard, in my opinion, to accidentally make bridge loops with physical cables. And most of the time when we first learn about spanning tree protocol, we think about accidentally, you know, putting cables in a weird way, and all of a sudden we get a bridge loop. It becomes very easy, painfully easy, to make bridge loops with multiple VLANs. In particular, if you tag too many VLANs for a particular port, you can have a real problem with it. Companies like Netgear use PVID functions to try to get around STP. Cisco tends to go with the more old school proper configuration of STP. So I guess what you're saying, I guess you're talking Cisco, I'm rusty on this. When you say point to point, I guess what you're trying to say is, please isolate these 2 ports. This is the old dynamic desirable for the Cisco port. We're going beyond where I want to go with this, but that is actually a very interesting question. And because you don't want to make bridge loops with VLANs. It's easy to do. So Nigel, most of what we're talking about now, especially at this endpoint, is my good friend Don, who asks very interesting questions, but none of this would be on any of the CompTIA exams. What I need you to remember for the CompTIA exams is remember what a VLAN number looks like. Understand conceptually what inter-VLAN routing is. No CompTIA exam's ever going to ask you to actually configure inter-VLAN routing. Make sure you understand why we VLAN. And make sure you understand conceptually what trunking is. That's pretty much the only questions you're going to run into. Techie Tommy, where do I attach an anti-static wrist strap when working on a laptop? So Techie Tommy, what I will usually do when I'm working on a laptop is I will either try to get to some metal piece at the back of the laptop, or the other thing, I've got little metal clips that I can snap. You can't really see that. I don't want to, because it's going to turn it off. But putting it into anything metal, you can literally put it into a port. You're not going to hurt anything. Make sure everything's turned off. Okay. Sorry, that made me laugh. Don Odingo, router on a stick. Router on a stick. Don, we mentioned router on a stick. I don't really like to do it. To me, especially with prices these days, there's very little reason not to have a classic L3 switch anymore. And router on a stick is definitely a thing. And we have already mentioned it today. All right, guys, it looks like we're wrapping up questions for today. Folks, I'm going to go ahead and call it a day today. When we get back on Wednesday evening, we are moving back into the world of virtual machines. Folks, keep in mind that this is going to be a series of shows that are talking about how to use virtual machines to do two things. Number one, learn what virtual machines are. And then number two, how to use virtual machines to learn about things like if you're a Windows user and you want to use Linux, don't install Linux on a perfectly good machine. Just put it in a VM and learn how to use Linux that way. All kinds of different stuff like that. So 2 days from now, starting next Wednesday at 7 p.m. Central Daylight Time, we're going to be moving back into setting up VirtualBox, which I've chosen VirtualBox. We had a great series on some of the other Type 2 or Type 2-ish hypervisors, and I'm going to go with VirtualBox because I know it the best. Although I got to tell you, VMware Player really impressed me. And we're going to be doing some configurations, setting up virtual networks and kind of fun stuff like that. And so we're going to do this maybe 2, maybe 3 episodes, at least until we run out of questions on VM configuration. We're going to be setting up networks. We're going to be putting routers into virtual machine networks. We're going to be using OpenSense. I might still be using pfSense. I can't decide which one I want to use. They're both fine. So we're going to be doing some fun configuration. So it's what you're basically doing, folks, is you can use virtual machines, hypervisors, Type 2 hypervisors, like VirtualBox, to teach yourself a ton of networking stuff. And that's really what our goal is we're going to look at. There are some limitations. You'll run into some stuff that's a little irritating. But so that's what we're going to be doing on Wednesday. All right, folks, I am out of here. And I will be talking to you guys soon. And get an old system from a dumpster installed on Linux. Andre, you can absolutely do that. We absolutely can do that. Don, thank you, Dave. Thank you. You're welcome, Don. Nigel, whoop, whoop, whoop. PCIe bifurcation. Nigel, I don't even know what PCIe bifurcation is, but now you got me interested. Nigel, the fact that I don't even know what it is. Anybody else know what PCIe bifurcation is? PCI bifurcation. What is it? How to enable? Running multiple NVMe drives from a single PCIe slot. Why won't you consider it? PCIe, oh, so it means to take a PCIe slot and split it into like a 16-lane PCIe and break it into 2 8s or 4 4s. Okay. Why would anybody want to do that? Reading. And this article is a Supermicro article from 2020. Doesn't really say what the benefit is. It looks like something you configure. You have to have a BIOS support for it. I guess it allows better speed or something. I don't know. Well, I'll tell you what, this is actually Nigel, this is a good thing. Nigel, please consider taking a look and joining our Discord channel. The Total Seminars Discord channel is a great place. Nigel, we got a lot of great techs on here, a lot of them. And they're good at answering questions. And here's a perfect example of me saying the 3 words that every tech loves to hear, I don't know. And so there are lots of folks out there. And you can definitely get some answers from there as well. I am not in a position right now, Nigel, where I can research this. I apologize. I am so buried in research right now that I'm unable to do it. But Nigel, you might be able to get somebody, if you're real nice, and you can see what they might be able to help you with. Dave Rush. Takes a X channel and creates 2 slots with X channel supports mode. Yeah, okay, Dave, I understand that it splits them. I don't see what the benefit is. There's going to be some bandwidth issue or something. Hey, Nigel, this is what we're here for. We're here to answer questions. All right, guys, I really am out the door here. I will be talking to you guys soon. Be sure to show up on Wednesday for more virtual machine fun. Until then, this is your little Uncle Mikey saying bye-bye. Bye, kids.